It has been a long road to the Iowa caucuses. There's been some attrition this week. You may know that former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie dropped out of the race this week before the Iowa caucuses. Indeed, he dropped out of the race before a debate between Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida and former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley. They debated on Wednesday. Vivek Ramaswamy remains in the race, although he is polling very low. Donald Trump remains the presumptive frontrunner, at least in the polls. He has been going to Iowa in the last few days. He was there for a town hall with Fox News on Wednesday night, counter-programmed against CNN's debate. Yesterday, he was in court in New York with the civil fraud trial in Manhattan to determine the punishments against the Trump organization. That also became a very political appearance for him as well. He's been getting a lot of political mileage out of this. And it remains to be seen what Iowans are going to do. There are a number of good, smart write-ups about what to watch out for on Iowa caucus night. I'll walk you through some of them. I don't have any predictions for the Iowa caucus. I don't know if you do. Feel free to put your thoughts in the chat about the Iowa caucuses, by the way. Questions, comments, thoughts. If you've ever voted in the Iowa caucus, I would love to know what you thought. Although this year it's structured a little bit differently. It's not the same as it has been in the past. And I will tell you more about that in just a minute. Let me begin with this from one of the stations in Iowa, which is KCCI. They are one of the local affiliate stations in Iowa. Just explaining what this is. First of all, before I get to any of that stuff, I don't want anyone who is listening to me right now to put too much attention on the Iowa caucuses. They're one vote, and they are very different from the rest of the country. The Iowa caucuses do matter. I wouldn't say that they don't. They absolutely do. But please don't get too connected to the Iowa caucuses for an array of reasons. One of which being that the Iowa caucuses don't often predict who is going to be the nominee. The people who count themselves as Republicans in Iowa are not quite the same as the people who count themselves as Republicans in New Hampshire, or the people who count themselves as Republicans in Nevada, or Florida, or South Carolina. They have some significant differences. And I know that we in the press love to talk about like these big turning point moments, the Iowa caucuses. Don't get it twisted. The Iowa caucuses are important, but they're not necessarily predictive. In fact, they are usually not predictive. Larry Sabato from the University of Virginia runs their Center for Politics. He is one of the smartest nonpartisan voices on politics that I look to. And he put out a guide ahead of the Iowa caucuses on their site in which he kind of breaks this down a little bit further. Here's how Larry Sabato puts it, quote, "Historically, winning Iowa has neither been necessary nor sufficient for winning either party's presidential nomination. Many caucus winners have failed to win the nomination, and many nomination winners have failed to win Iowa," unquote. And then he works his way down. Back in 1972, Democrats, the number one finisher in the Iowa caucuses was uncommitted. That's kind of like saying none of the above. It's kind of a remarkable outcome. But Ed Muskie was technically the front runner. George McGovern finished second, but he ultimately got the nomination. 1976, uncommitted, finished first among the Democrats, but Jimmy Carter got the most support, which helped him get the nomination. Gerald Ford narrowly held off Ronald Reagan in the Iowa caucuses. David Yepsen called it a straw poll in sample precincts that was taken as an early sign of Ford's weakness as a candidate. But he still got the nomination that year. 1980, Jimmy Carter easily beat Ted Kennedy, won the nomination, didn't win the presidency. Kennedy's challenge helped expose Carter's weaknesses. George H.W. Bush upset Reagan, who'd win the nomination, and then picked Bush as his running mate. So Bush beat Reagan in the Iowa caucuses in 1980, but Reagan beat Bush for the nomination and then made Bush his VP. 84, Walter Mondale wins handily in the Democratic Iowa caucuses. Gary Hart finished second, but he ended up pushing Mondale for the nomination before losing to the former VP. 88, Michael Dukakis finished third. Bob Dole got nearly double the support of Bush, but Bush won the nomination. So you get the point. I won't go through every single one of these. You get the point. The Iowa caucuses are worth watching because it begins the season. It begins the political kind of race to the finish line, which is not going to feel like a race. I think it's going to feel like a decathlon at best. But it's worth watching just to know kind of we're off to the races, we're off and running. Wouldn't ignore it, but I wouldn't plan your night around it. Not unless you're that person. Unless you're that person, and then I'm not gonna hold it against you. One of the people who is that person who would plan their night around it is Amy Walter of the Cook Political Report. She is also fabulous. Cook Political Report is a paid service. It's behind a paywall, but they do amazing journalism, nonpartisan journalism. They're the ones that I told you that follow every single district in Congress in terms of who's up and who's down, all of the governor's races, all of the Senate races very granularly. So they're the ones who kind of like do the deep, independent, nonpartisan political analysis of elections and campaigns, specifically the horse race, rather than kind of day-to-day politics. Amy Walter, who is the head of the Cook Political Report, dropped a piece about Iowa caucuses today. And it begins, I thought, in a very interesting way. Here's the way that Amy Walter puts it in Cook Political. Quote, "For the first time since I've been covering politics, the Iowa caucuses are a snoozer. It's hard to get excited about a contest where the frontrunner is leading by more than 30 points. No one I've spoken with who is involved at any level with the Republican presidential contest thinks former President Donald Trump will lose. The only mildly interesting speculation involves the size of Trump's win and whether Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who has staked the fate of his campaign on the state, will come in second or third place behind former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley," unquote. So Amy's one of the sharpest people I know talking about electoral campaign politics. If the good money is that former President Trump is going to take it, then okay, perhaps the Iowa caucus is useful in a couple of other ways. Iowa tends to have a very large evangelical population. A lot of the reporting leading up to the Iowa caucuses has been about people who apparently consider Donald Trump to be a godly man or a man of God, one of the two. That might be part of the indication of how his cultural base looks, rather than whether or not he looks politically viable or whether he'll win the nomination, but some of the cultural connection. Evangelical Christians, people who call themselves evangelical Christians, practice evangelical Christianity, profess a personal relationship with God through Jesus Christ, were among the most important bases of support. I think you cannot whip up that kind of messianic zeal for a candidate who has been so irreligious through his life unless you are able to appeal to that base. That's why he has such a strong hold on the Republican Party. If anyone ever looks at the party and goes, why is Donald Trump so popular in the party? It's because people believe that God is on his side. I mean, when you boil it right down, a lot of his political support comes very squarely from people of faith. Personally, I prefer Abraham Lincoln's approach. Abraham Lincoln once said, "Let us pray not that God is on our side, but that we are on God's side." That's what I'd prefer, but that's just me. So I think the Iowa caucuses could be useful in terms of looking at what a very core, solidly conservative, red state Republican evangelical voter thinks of the candidates that are out there. None of the candidates, I think, has actually stepped on their own feet when it comes to dealing with evangelical Christians. But Iowa is much more reflective of that evangelical base than a lot of other places. Some of the other things that Amy notes, Amy Walter is going to watch whether or not Donald Trump gets to 50%, not just the margin of victory, but whether or not he really has command of majorities there. It looks like, at least to Amy, that it looks more like 35, 45% than 45 or above. And it's possible, and Amy is kind of pointing to this, well, I'll just read it to you from her piece. Quote, "The candidate capable of putting together a coalition of never-Trump Republicans, who make up anywhere from 15 to 20% of the electorate, and sometimes Trump Republicans, who are about 35 to 50% of the electorate, can beat the former president in a one-on-one contest. That theory, however, goes out the window if he rolls up a majority of the vote," unquote. So you had Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley and Chris Christie trying to appeal to those never Trump, sometimes Trump Republicans, particularly DeSantis and Haley had been talking about that a lot in their more recent debates and town halls, trying not to kind of punch back at Donald Trump, but saying there's a better way to accomplish the same things, right? And so that's part of what Iowa might reveal. Have they been able to build some coalitions outside of the core Trump base? Have they been able to pull a few people away who were kind of on that edge, who really would like someone who's not quite so, as Nikki Haley put it, chaotic, or what's the other phrase she used? In his feelings. Never heard that on the campaign trail, but okay, do you, boo. Man, can they pull those people away and build a strong enough coalition? I don't know that they can or have, but we'll see. Maybe. Other things Amy says she's looking for, whether or not Nikki Haley is able to make inroads with voters outside her natural base. South Carolina, presumably, she's going to be great. New Hampshire, she's been endorsed. The next state, New Hampshire, she's been endorsed by its governor, Chris Sununu. So can she get some momentum among the rest of the voters that she needs early on? Evangelical, conservative, Republican, non-college educated voters. Can she do that? Why? Amy Walter makes it clear. The South Carolina electorate looks much more like Iowa than New Hampshire. For example, 2016 exit polls, a quarter of New Hampshire voters identified as evangelical and 42% as independent. In Iowa, South Carolina, 2/3 evangelical, 20 to 22% independent. So you have basically Iowa, New Hampshire, and then Iowa again. That's the way that that's the cadence for these different elections. That's why they're worth watching. And I would look at Iowa, not so much just because of Iowa, but because of South Carolina. That really is more the point. Also, the other piece of it, and I'm just going to look this up very quickly, but I think we already know the weather in Iowa looks miserable. The National Weather Service out of Des Moines, just pulling up their latest forecast. Oh, geez. Latest snowfall totals through today. 6 inches of snow at Des Moines Airport. National Weather Service weather station in Des Moines, 7 inches of snow through noon today. So the weather is going to be a huge factor. At a number of the airports around town, zero visibility, zero. So it's going to be, I mean, it's a half-mile visibility at Des Moines International right now. So it's going to be a little bit wild, kind of looking outside. Here's an image of Interstate 80 near Victor. I-80 runs from coast to coast, more or less, almost coast to coast anyway. This is I-80, runs from Oakland to New Jersey, I believe. Just whiteout conditions, total whiteout. So how are people going to get there to vote? Are people going to get there to vote? Or will this make it significantly harder for people to be able to vote in the Iowa caucuses? You look at some of the wind chill forecasts for next week, according to the National Weather Service, Monday wind chills, Monday evening for when the Iowa caucuses happen. Lord Jesus. Oh my God. I can't. Wind chill forecast. Des Moines as low as the 30s, -31, wind chill. Waterloo, Iowa, -31. Ames, Iowa, -32. Carroll, Iowa, -35. Life-threatening cold. So not only do we want to know how people are going to vote, we want to know if people are going to vote, if they're even going to show up to these caucuses. And a caucus is not just for voting for the president. You're also voting for delegates who are going to continue the process of saying, the great state of Iowa and Des Moines nominates so-and-so for president. Like, that's also happening. It's a party business meeting. That's why it's different from a primary where you go in, you vote, you leave. A caucus is literally a gathering. And that gathering may not be so well gathered if people are facing life-threatening cold. Lord Jesus. I'm glad I vote in Nevada. Yeah. But we'll see. We will see how that goes. We'll see how that turns out. But again, I would not look too much at Iowa for its own sake. I would look past Iowa to South Carolina because I think that's really where there is some value in there. The other thing to note, by the way, in terms of who we are as voters, I will be harping on this. I just want you to know that this is going to be my axe to grind for a very, very long time. So if you don't like this, you need to just turn the show off because you're going to hear this over and over. One of the things I need you to remember, this is me banging my drink on the table so that you look up. One of the things that I need you to remember when we look at the divide in this country, there is a huge piece of this divide that my former colleagues in the mainstream press do not talk about. And they should. My partner always criticized me, like, don't clap your syllables. People don't like that. To hell with that. Pay attention, mainstream media. And you pay attention too. The largest portion of voters in this country is not reflected by the race we're covering. The largest portion of American voters are not Democrats and they're not Republicans. Look at the latest Gallup poll. The largest portion of voters in this country are independents. We are not a red-blue divided country. We are red-blue blank. Let me say that again for the people in the back. America is not a nation of red versus blue. We are a nation of red, blue, blank. People who want to be firmly on one side or the other, and people who want nothing to do with any of it. The more we look at ourselves as two opposing sides, the farther we get from bridging our partisan divide. Why? Because most of us, the largest portion of us, don't even live in that damn divide. We want nothing to do with it. And unless we can have a conversation about politics that actually includes everyone, including the people who are like, New Dealer, I'm out, we're never going to make progress. Please do not believe these people who tell you that we are a world of left versus right. There's also the center and there's the outside. And the largest portion of Americans, poll after poll shows this, describe themselves as not being on the left or the right, as not being a D or an R. They don't want either of it. That's why the primary process has to be watched very differently, because you're looking at a minority within a minority of the American electorate. They do not speak for most Americans. They have every right to pick their own candidate, but by definition, they don't speak for most of the country. So why are we paying it so much damn attention? It's interesting, and it's easier to talk about than the complexity of the American people as we really are. It's hard to complexify the country for itself. It's way easier to just Jets Sharks the whole thing and call it good. It's not good enough. It never was. Take a look at what Gallup found. Independent party identification tied for a high. Democratic Party identification at a new low. According to Gallup, political independents continue to constitute the largest political bloc in the U.S., with an average of 43% of U.S. adults identifying this way in 2023, tying a record high from 2014. Independent identification has been 40% or higher every year since 2011, except for the 2016 and 2020 presidential election years. I think that's understandable. A number of independent voters will pick one party just to be part of the primaries and then return back to their independent affiliation. But take a look at this chart. Hold on just one second. Let me pull this up so you can see the scope of how this has moved over time. Here it is. U.S. political ideology identification. From 1992 to 2023, Gallup has asked the same question. How would you describe your political views? Very conservative, moderate, liberal, or very liberal? They also asked, how do you consider yourself a Republican, Democrat, Independent? Which one do you lean more towards? This flip-flops back and forth in terms of what people lean toward. There was a cross in the 90s where Republican dropped. They were basically tied in the years after 9/11, 2022, 2023. And fewer Americans identify as Republican than Democrat for a long time, but that just flipped in 2023, and not by much. It had been pretty much tied in 2022, barely flipped in 2023. But if you ask, do you consider yourself a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent? 43% independent. 27% both Democratic and Republican. They had been tied again last year, but decreasing. And if you look since like the 2000s, overall, the percentage of people who call themselves partisans at all is decreasing. Now, some of these might be libertarians or Green Party candidates or socialist candidates. I don't know. Gallup doesn't ask. But I think it's important for us to be very mindful that over time, particularly since the 2000s began, the American people have been moving away from partisan politics. So what happens to all of these homeless voters? Where do they go? What do they do? I find it kind of fascinating. But anyway,